Oil. Drillers go bust for it. Nations go to war for it. Nobody can get enough. From a single 50-foot derrick to platform cities taller than the tallest buildings. It's a high-risk gamble that can make you a billionaire or ruin your life. Now, passion, luck, and science in the search for black gold on Modern Marvels. In the early 1600s, when European explorers first entered the wooded hills of western Pennsylvania, they found something they'd never encountered before, a black oozing substance that seeped up from the ground in viscous bubbles. The local Indians touted the substance as a folk medicine cure-all for everything from burns to broken bones. They also used it to caulk their canoes. Native Americans were not the first to make use of this natural resource. The walls of Jericho were held together with oil-based tar as mortar. And according to the Bible, Noah applied 2 coats of tar to the outside of the ark to make it watertight. Oil had been formed over millions of years from prehistoric plant and animal life that decayed and was compressed under great pressure. But it wasn't until the 1850s that it burst forth into the modern world and triggered a revolution. The man who launched this revolution was a New York lawyer with an entrepreneurial flair named George Bissell. He had seen how Pennsylvania oil was collected from the surface and used in medicinal elixirs popular at the time.
Rub it on wounds, cuts, abrasions, rashes, pimples, sores, scratches, and other afflictions of the epidermis.
But Bissell had another idea for this miracle substance. Could oil, he wondered, be somehow harnessed for illumination? Lamps burning whale oil were still the dominant source of home lighting, but the price of whale oil had been rising precipitously.
Whale oil was extracted from the blubber and oil of the spermaceti whale. And of course the spermaceti whales were hunted extensively in the 1830s and 1840s, to the point that by the 1850s the world herd, as it was accessible at the time, was very much depleted. And that of course drove the price of spermaceti whale oil, as they called it, up.
As a possible alternative to whale oil, Bissell, in 1854, sent a sample of the Pennsylvania oil to a chemistry professor at Yale for analysis. 3 months later, the professor confirmed Bissell's wild dream.
Your company have in their possession a raw material from which, by simple and not expensive processes, they may manufacture very valuable products.
He discovered that through boiling the oil, it could be distilled into a high-quality illuminating fluid called kerosene, which burned with a clean, bright flame. Bissell and his partner, New Haven banker John Townsend, formed the Seneca Oil Company and acquired land in Pennsylvania. The problem they faced was how to get the oil in large enough quantities to create a kerosene market. The solution came from a bottle of make-believe medicine. While in a druggist shop one day in 1856, Bissell saw an advertisement for a miracle elixir, Kier's rock oil medicine, that featured on its label a derrick used to drill water wells. Water distillers in Pennsylvania had long been plagued with the problem of oil seeping into their wells. It was this unwanted oil that Samuel Kier bottled and sold. In a giant leap of understanding, Bissell immediately grasped that drilling for oil might make sense. What they needed was someone to supervise the drilling of a well. Townsend suggested his friend Edwin Drake.
Edwin Drake was probably not the most obvious choice to drill what became the Pioneer oil well. He had been a purser on a steamboat, he had been a conductor on the New Haven Railroad, and so on. I think his major qualification for the job was that he needed work at the time.
When it was announced that this well would be drilled for the express purpose of finding oil in the area there, Drake became a laughingstock. Everybody laughed at him. So in order for his backers to give him some credibility, all of the mail that went into him had the title Colonel on it. So when the postmaster saw it, oh, he's a colonel. So he was known as Colonel Drake.
In the spring of 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, Colonel Drake hired a local blacksmith named Uncle Billy Smith, and they began drilling for oil. As the months passed, they hit water, but nothing else. The oil industry's first well seemed destined to be the oil industry's first dry hole. As they saw their few $1,000s draining down Drake's well, the investors grew increasingly wary. Finally, in August 1859, Townsend sent Drake the last of the money and told him to close up the operation and return home. Townsend's letter arrived on Monday, August 29, 1859, but to his everlasting gratitude, it was one day too late. For on Sunday the 28th, with the well at 69.5 feet, Edwin Drake looked down the hole and saw something dark floating to the surface. When he asked what it was, Uncle Billy answered simply, "That's your fortune. The oil age had just begun." The well produced 35 barrels of oil a day. Each barrel held 40 gallons, and they sold it for $40 a barrel, almost $700 a barrel in today's dollars. Within days, the first oil boom was underway. The population of Titusville quadrupled overnight, and land prices skyrocketed as trainloads of newcomers converged on the town with money in their hands and greed in their hearts. Little more than a year later, Titusville had 75 wells producing oil and 15 refineries distilling kerosene. A local newspaper editor wrote of the period,
"The oil and land excitement in this section has already become a sort of epidemic. It embraces all classes and ages and conditions of men. They neither talk, nor look, nor act as they did 6 months ago. Land leases, contracts, refusals, deed arrangements, interests, and all that sort of talk is all they can comprehend."
Among those who got rich were investors George Bissell and John Townsend. Among those who didn't was Colonel Edwin Drake. A poor businessman, Drake did not patent any of his inventions, like the sinking of a stovepipe down the well to hold water out and keep the well from collapsing. What money he did make, he lost in bad investments and died a virtual ward of the state, bitter about the fortunes others had amassed from his discovery. It was written of him when he died, "He shook the boughs for others to gather the fruits." We now return to modern marvels. Drake's discovery in western Pennsylvania lit up the globe. Today in the 20th century, it's hard to imagine the impact kerosene could have on the world of the 19th century, but it revolutionized society. As large amounts of oil were pumped up from the underground reservoir Drake had tapped, virtually overnight, kerosene became the dominant source of home illumination in America and Europe.
You probably bought it from a street vendor if you lived in a city. If you lived in a small town, as a lot of Americans still did, you almost certainly bought kerosene at a general store.
Compared to $5 a gallon for whale oil, kerosene prices varied from 10 to 25 cents a gallon. From Drake's 35 barrels a day in 1859, the Pennsylvania oil region was only 3 years later shipping out more than 8,000 barrels of crude oil a day. Huge refineries opened up in major cities along the rail lines where the oil was sent. By 1865, Cleveland alone had 30 refineries. Like the rest of the burgeoning young oil industry, refining too was a rough and tumble, cutthroat business. And no one was more perfectly suited to it than a young Cleveland businessman who owned the city's largest refining plant. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and his dark genius for the oil business would soon make him the richest and most reviled man in America.
John D. Rockefeller got into the oil business with a dry goods wholesaling partner during the Civil War. Got into it in a small way with a fairly conventional refinery, disposing of most of his goods in the immediate vicinity of Cleveland.
By relentlessly pouring profits back into his business, Rockefeller expanded to a second refinery, then to an export business to service Europe. He bought boats, tanker cars, storage facilities. Finally, in 1870, he consolidated all his businesses under one name, the Standard Oil Company. By that point, Rockefeller already controlled 1/10 of the entire American refining industry. But that wasn't enough. He wanted nothing less than to control it all. In the 1870s, Rockefeller's pursuit of industry control set a new standard of ruthlessness. Bribery, extortion, collusion, and intimidation were just some of the weapons he used. Those competitors he couldn't take over, he drove out of business. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the nation's refining capacity. By 1890, John D. Rockefeller was the wealthiest man in America. He moved to New York, dividing his time between an opulent Manhattan townhouse and a vast estate in the country north of the city. But acquiring that level of wealth had also made Rockefeller one of the most feared and hated men in the country. Mothers warned their children to be good, or Rockefeller will get you.
Rockefeller really became a popular target, largely because he had very little sensitivity to what we today would call public image or public reputation. Public opinion was certainly that he was an avaricious, ruthless kind of person.
But as Standard Oil's stranglehold on the industry grew, so did assaults on Rockefeller's monopolistic practices. In 1904, immediately after his election, President Teddy Roosevelt launched an investigation of Standard Oil. 2 years later, the government brought suit against the company under antitrust provisions. Roosevelt called Standard's executives the biggest criminals in the country. The case was in the courts for 5 years. But in 1911, while he was hunting big game in Africa, Roosevelt got the good news. Standard Oil would be dismantled into numerous smaller companies. Rockefeller had lost his monopoly for good. The breakup of Standard Oil hardly meant the end of massive fortunes to be made from oil, especially since a market 100 times larger than kerosene was about to emerge. America was about to go car crazy. Refining kerosene had always left producers with a hazardous and unwanted byproduct that was usually just pumped into pits and burned. It was called gasoline. But in garages all over Europe and America, inventors were tinkering with something known as the internal combustion engine. And gasoline turned out to be just the right fuel to put it on the road. By the turn of the century, the automobile was a major sensation, said Frank Phillips, founder of Phillips Petroleum.
I think people are going to buy quite a passel of these little gasoline buggies, and they need gasoline to make them go. It may be the thing of the future.
Automobile registrations, which numbered 8,000 nationwide in 1900, skyrocketed to 900,000 12 years later. The market for gasoline was suddenly enormous, and new supplies of oil were desperately needed to fill the tanks of these new tin Lizzies. New oil fields were discovered in West Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana. Near the turn of the century, a large field was discovered in Southern California, and by 1910, California led the world in oil production, most of it controlled by the Union Oil Company. And the oil fields became a backdrop for the new movie industry developing in Hollywood. But all this oil still wasn't enough to quench the insatiable thirst of the automobile. What the world needed was a huge new source of oil, and the man who would give it to them was Petillo Higgins. A one-armed lumberman from Beaumont, Texas, Higgins was fascinated by an area outside Beaumont known as Big Hill, where sulfur water and gas seeped up through the soil. Higgins believed there was oil to be found there, too.
He just had an idea. It was a hunch. Let's call it divine, if you want to. In fact, in the early days, more oil and gas was found by people drilling by the seat of their pants than there were by geology and geophysics.
Till that time, the oil that had been tapped was found between the Earth's surface and the first thick layer of underground rock. But Higgins believed there could be oil underneath that rock, oil under great pressure, great enough to force up the gases Big Hill was known for. The geologists he brought to the site all dismissed Big Hill as oil field material. And in 7 years of trying to prove them wrong, Higgins had nothing but 3 dry holes to show for it.
They put an ad in the paper about he wanted to drill this well, where it was, and everything else. And he only got one reply, and that was from Anthony Lucas.
Anthony Lucas was a mining engineer and former captain in the Austrian Navy who thought Higgins might be right. He formed a group of investors giving Higgins 10% as a finder's fee, and in October of 1900 began drilling in an area of the hill known as Spindletop Heights. The type of drilling system Lucas and Higgins used was known as a rotary rig, and is essentially the same drilling system used to find oil today.
This derrick is used to support the weight of the drilling pipe. As you drill, you're coming in and out of the hole, and you need a huge block and tackle, essentially what it is, that will pull this pipe out and pull up new joints to screw in to make deeper hole. So you have to have a very, very strong derrick to support that weight. When they're drilling these wells, they have a bit on the end of the pipe, and they start the hole and go down, and every time they want to go deeper, they just screw on another 30 foot of drill pipe. And they just keep turning to the right, and the mud goes down the center of the pipe, goes through the bit and out the outside in between it and where it has cut the hole, so it will take out the cuttings.
Using a steam-powered drill and crew of 4, Lucas hit solid rock at 900 feet, the rock Patillo Higgins believed sat on top of the oil. With new drill bits designed for boring through rock, Lucas pushed on, past 1,000 feet, then 1,100 feet. On January 10, 1901, at 1,160 feet, the bit broke through the rock. Suddenly, the well began spitting up mud, then lengths of the drill pipe itself, plus gas and rocks, and then, finally, oil too began shooting up into the sky with tremendous force, 150 feet high.
It was pandemonium. Everybody went crazy. Lucas was in his home, and somebody came running up to the house and said, it's in. And there was a man that was working in the rice fields nearby. And he turned around to his fellow worker, and he said, "My God, what a gusher."